So Catherine sat down in front of a camera last week and did the one thing the palace almost never allows anybody to do. She had a script. The communications people had prepared it, the way they prepare everything, and it had been through the hands of enough advisors that every sentence in it had been sanded smooth. She read it. She looked at it for a while. Then she put it face down on the table beside her and spoke about her youngest son in her own words. Without notes, without approval, and without telling anybody in advance that she was going to. And she cried while she did it. Not at the start. About 2/3 of the way through on a sentence about Louis, and she carried on talking through it rather than stopping, which is somehow worse to watch than if she had broken down completely. Now, the palace has form here. Kensington does not do unscripted. Kensington does not do tears. Everything that reaches you about those 3 children has been arranged, cleared, and timed, and that is not cynicism. That is the actual policy, deliberately, for over 10 years. And the question that matters is not what Catherine said. The question is what pushed a woman that disciplined into saying it at all. Because something had been going on in that family for months, and the country had noticed the shape of it without understanding it. Engagements rearranged with no reason given. Schedules shifting at short notice. A boy who simply was not appearing anywhere. No explanation offered, no explanation promised. And a press office that answered every question about the youngest Wales child with the same 4 polite words about family privacy. That silence was not an accident. William built it. He argued for it from the beginning, and he defended it for years against people inside his own household who kept telling him it was going to backfire. And then it backfired, in the one way nobody in that building had planned for, and I will get to exactly how. Because it is not what you are expecting. If you are new here, hit subscribe before we go on, because this story is still moving, and there is more of it coming this month. Quick word before we go further. I'm Harold. I spend my time going through everything that moves around this family, the filings, the official records, the stories that got buried before anybody finished asking questions, and what you're about to hear is me putting the pieces together the way I read them. Stay with me to the end, because that last page is where this whole thing lands, and it lands on a conversation between a father and an 8-year-old boy on the floor of a garden room. Start with the policy, because the policy is real. And it is older than most people realize. George was born in 2013. Within about a year of that, William and Catherine settled on an approach to their children that has not moved since. And the Scottish Daily Express described it this month accurately as a 10-year plan to let those children lead normal lives. That is the framing from actual reporting, not from me. A decade of deliberate decisions about where those kids appear. How often, at what age, and in whose company. You have seen the results of it your whole life without noticing. 3 children who appear perhaps a handful of times a year. Christmas at Sandringham, a balcony, a carefully chosen sporting event. Photographs released by their own mother, rather than taken by anybody else. On her own camera, on her own timing, because a photograph you release is a photograph nobody can sell. That is the machine William built. And he built it for a reason that has nothing to do with modern communication strategy and everything to do with a Saturday in September 1997. He was 15. He walked behind his mother's coffin through the streets of London in a dark suit while the entire world watched him do it. And every private thing Diana had ever owned became public property inside a fortnight. Her letters, her handwriting, her clothes sold and displayed. Her voice on tapes she never intended anybody to hear. William learned at 15 exactly what this country does with a royal life, once it gets its hands on the details, and he has spent nearly 30 years since then making sure it never gets its hands on his children. Every closed door in this story starts there. Hold on to that, because by the end of this video it turns all the way around on him. Now, the last several months are where the policy stopped working, and the timeline is worth laying out properly. Louis is 8. He is the youngest of the 3, which in that family means he has the least defined role and the most protection, and both of those things have been true his entire life. George is 13 and has a future that everybody can describe. Charlotte is 11 and has a public presence she has been growing into since she could walk. Louis has been the one they kept back. For a long stretch this year, he was kept back completely. Appearances that had been penciled in came off the schedule. 2 family events he had attended in previous years went ahead without him. The pattern was consistent enough that people who follow this family closely started counting the months, and the counting produced exactly the sort of speculation the policy exists to prevent, which is the first irony in a story that ends up full of them. And I want to be fair to the policy before we watch it fail, because it worked for a decade and almost nobody gives it credit for that. Those 3 children have grown up with something no royal child before them had. George got to be 9 years old in public about 4 times. Charlotte has never had a school photograph sold to a newspaper. Nobody has a long lens picture of any of them crying or falling over, or having the sort of afternoon every child has and no child should have to see printed. Compare that to what William and Harry were by the age of 8, which was a running feature in the national press with photographers stationed outside the school gates. William built that deliberately, against considerable pressure, and it is probably the single most successful thing he has done in his working life. Hold that in your head, because the reason this story hurts is that the thing which failed was not a mistake. It was his best work. The turning point happened at Windsor, at a private rehearsal, and it is the moment Catherine later described as the point where she stopped being able to hold the line. The rehearsal was supposed to be gentle, a practice run before a formal appearance, in a room with no crowds, no cameras, and nobody outside the household present, so that the boy could work out how to stand and where to walk without an audience learning anything about how it went. Halfway through the morning, Louis stopped and reached for his mother's hand, and he asked her whether he was allowed to be seen, not whether he wanted to go, whether he was allowed. Catherine knelt down beside him and took both his hands, and she has told at least 2 people since that she could not think of a single sentence to say back to him that was both true and reassuring at the same time. William cleared the room of everybody except the household staff who had to be there, and he had George and Charlotte taken to another part of the residence, because he did not want either of them to see their brother asking that question. That morning changed the temperature inside that household completely, and everything that follows is people reacting to it. William's response was to shut everything down. He suspended every engagement involving Louis with immediate effect and made it clear he was not interested in discussing it. One missed ceremony, he said, mattered less than nothing next to a child who had begun to think there was a reason he was being kept away. Honestly, it is hard to argue with the instinct. It is also the moment the whole thing began to come apart, and the people who tried to tell him so were the ones nobody in the family ever listens to. Senior aides warned him that repeated absences would attract questions, and I should explain the word here, because it does real work in that building. An engagement, in royal terms, is an official duty or public appearance carried out on behalf of the monarchy, and the entire visible life of that institution is built out of them. They are scheduled months ahead. They are logged, they are published, and when a member of that family stops appearing at them, the absence is a matter of record rather than a matter of gossip. You do not need a source inside the palace to notice. You need a diary. The advisors wanted a controlled explanation, released before speculation filled the gap. Something short, something vague, something that would let the press office answer questions with a document rather than a shrug. And the aides were not being cynical, which is the part people get wrong about that job. Their entire function is to look 18 months ahead and work out which silence is going to become a story. They had seen this exact shape before, with Catherine herself in 2024, when a gap in the public schedule and a refusal to explain it produced several months of speculation that went to places nobody could have predicted and did real damage to a real person, before the palace finally said what was going on. They were not asking William to expose his son. They were telling him that an unexplained absence does not stay empty, and that somebody always fills it, and that he would not get to choose who. William refused, flatly, repeatedly, and for months. He would not allow his son's situation to become a public narrative while the child was still uncertain and frightened, and he had 30 years of personal evidence for why that mattered. He was right about the danger and wrong about the solution, and the gap between those two things is this entire story. because the silence did not stay contained around Louis. It spread through that house and it got into the other two children, and neither parent saw it happening until it was well established. George is 13, which is old enough to understand that something is wrong and young enough to think it is his job to absorb it. He decided calmness was expected of him. He got quieter, more careful, more useful around the house, and both his parents read that as him coping well, because that is what it looks like from outside. Then one night he asked his father whether a younger brother could be kept out of everything without anybody outside the family knowing. Sit with that question for a second, because it is not a question about protocol. He was asking whether the silence meant something bad. He was 13 years old, working out on his own that his family had stopped explaining things, and trying to establish whether the not explaining was the normal kind or the frightening kind. Charlotte is 11. And she went the other way entirely. She noticed every closed door. She noticed every conversation that changed direction when she came into a room, every lowered voice, every adult who suddenly had somewhere else to be. Nobody sat her down and told her anything, and she assembled a fairly accurate picture anyway, because 11-year-olds always do, and adults never believe it. And she did something with it that I keep coming back to. She started leaving handwritten jokes beside her brother's bed, not once, regularly, as a system. She had worked out on her own that when Louis laughed, he came back for a minute, and she went about producing that on purpose, in pencil, without telling anybody she was doing it. And later, when she overheard staff discussing the attention the family was starting to get, she went and found her mother and asked whether strangers were worried about her brother now. Then she asked whether Louis was going to have to answer them all. An 11-year-old should not be running that calculation. She ran it anyway because nobody had given her anything else to work with. And I'm going to hold the most important scene in this whole story for a while yet, because it happens between William and his son, and it happens on a floor, and if I give it to you now, it is a man and a boy sitting down, and you will not understand why it turned a future king inside out. It is coming. Everything between here and there is the reason it lands. Catherine was carrying something different from either of them, and she was carrying it alone. She was sitting with Charlotte explaining that these things sometimes move slowly, while getting almost no sleep herself. She was keeping her worst thoughts away from William to protect him. He was doing exactly the same thing back at her, for exactly the same reason, and neither of them had noticed that they had both stopped saying anything real. That is what long strain does to two people who love each other and are both trying to be the strong one. Nothing breaks. There is no argument, no coldness, nothing you could point at. The kindness just goes quiet and stays quiet, and after a few months, you are two people running parallel operations in the same house. And Louis was in the middle of it. 8 years old, too young to know a single thing about how any of that institution works, and old enough to read a room full of adults perfectly. He has always been the one who fills a quiet room. Anybody who has watched this family, the palace draft was sitting right next to them, in public for the last 6 years, knows exactly who he is, because he is the one who cannot sit still through a ceremony, and the one whose face ends up on the front pages doing something his grandmother would have raised an eyebrow at. Questions, noise, sudden energy, an ongoing negotiation with his mother about whether he has to stand up now. Being the youngest of 3 in that family means fewer expectations landing on you, and it also means you are the least explained person in the building. George's future gets discussed, Charlotte's role gets discussed, Louis has been allowed to just be a child, which is the kindest thing they could have done for him, and which left him with no framework at all for understanding why he had suddenly stopped going anywhere. The house got quieter around him. That is the part he actually noticed. Not a decision, not a conversation, just adults adjusting their volume. All of that leads to the night this whole thing broke open, and it broke open between the two of them after the children had gone to bed. Catherine had written her own statement. By hand, on paper, over several sittings, and she put those pages down on the table in front of her husband and let him read them. And if the term is unfamiliar, A palace-approved statement is wording that royal advisors have cleared before public release, and its purpose is to say something without creating anything new for anybody to ask about. It is a genuinely skilled piece of work. Every clause in it has been checked against what it might mean in 6 months. To Catherine, those sentences were empty. They described a situation without admitting there had been any fear in it. They mentioned things improving without saying a word about what the family had actually been through. They were, in the precise sense, unfalsifiable, and that is what she could not stand about them. William read.
For months, a theory spread across royal fan pages and comment sections that Prince Louis, the youngest child of William and Catherine, was being deliberately hidden from the public. People built entire timelines out of his absences. They compared photo counts year over year. They asked, in thousands of near-identical posts, why the most photogenic child in the family suddenly seemed to vanish from the record. And then, on the 1st of August 2026, Louis walked into the stands at the Sir Chris Hoy Velodrome in Glasgow wearing a Welsh cycling bucket hat, 2 sizes too big for him, fist bumped the Commonwealth Games mascot, and the theory collapsed in real time under the weight of the actual footage. What the nation got wasn't a confession, it was a correction. And the real story turns out to be less about concealment and more about a family that has spent 7 years running one of the most disciplined, deliberate media strategies in modern royal history. A strategy so effective that its own success got mistaken for a cover-up. Start with what actually happened, because the record is public, and it is dull in exactly the way real explanations tend to be. Louis was born in April 2018. He made his first appearance on the Buckingham Palace balcony that same year at Trooping the Colour, a 2-month-old baby held up to a crowd he could not yet see. Since then, Louis has followed almost the identical pattern his older siblings followed before him. A small handful of appearances a year, concentrated around Trooping the Colour, Christmas Day at Sandringham, occasional church services at Easter, and, once he reached school age, birthday portraits released by his own mother rather than captured by anyone else. That is not a new development brought on by scandal. It is policy, and it has been policy since William and Catherine's first child, George, was born in 2013. Royal correspondents, including Katie Nicholl, who has covered the Wales family for years and written extensively on their approach to raising their children out of the direct press glare, have described this as a conscious, long-running effort to let George, Charlotte, and Louis have as close to an ordinary childhood as their position allows. It was never a secret. It was, if anything, one of the more openly discussed aspects of how this particular generation of royals has chosen to parent. So, why did it suddenly look, in the early months of this year, like something had changed? Part of the answer sits in a piece published by PureWow in June, when a writer combing through dozens of photographs from Trooping the Colour noticed something conspicuously absent in nearly every shot of Louis, and the observation went mildly viral, feeding directly into the speculation that would build over the following weeks. People do this with royal photography constantly. They study body language, they count frames, they draw conclusions from silence, because silence is the one thing the palace has always been willing to offer instead of an explanation. And in a family that communicates almost entirely through carefully released images and short public statements, an absence reads as loudly as an announcement. The gap in the schedule does not stay empty. Someone always fills it with a theory, and this year, the theory that filled it was the darkest available one. To understand why the palace lets that happen, why it tolerates being misread rather than clarifying every gap, you have to go back to September 1997, because every instinct this family has about privacy traces back to a single funeral. William was 15 years old when he walked behind his mother's coffin through the streets of London, a 15-year-old boy performing composure for television cameras that had, in the eyes of many, contributed directly to the circumstances of her death. In the days that followed, the country's appetite for Diana's private life did not diminish. If anything, it intensified. Her letters were picked over. Her wardrobe became subject to public auction and exhibition. Biographers and journalists spent years reconstructing her private thoughts from second-hand testimony. William has spoken about this period publicly, if sparingly, across nearly 3 decades. In interviews, in documentaries marking the 20th anniversary of her death, and in his own public remarks about mental health and the cost of growing up under surveillance. Robert Jobson, a royal correspondent and biographer who has written extensively on William, has documented how directly this experience shaped William's approach to his own children's exposure to the press, an approach built, in Jobson's account, on the conviction that privacy in childhood is not a luxury, but something closer to a foundation. Every limit William has placed on how much of George, Charlotte, and Louis's lives becomes public property is, in that light, not paranoia. It is a lesson learned the hardest possible way, applied with total consistency for over a decade. That consistency is precisely what makes this year's coverage so revealing, because 2026 did not actually feature Louis disappearing. The documented public record shows the opposite. He appeared at Trooping the Color in June 2025 at 8 years old, delighting crowds with the same unfiltered charisma that had already made him something of a minor phenomenon since his balcony debut as a toddler. He was photographed at Easter services at St. George's Chapel in April 2026, sharing what onlookers described as a warm, playful moment with his grandfather, King Charles, outside the chapel, the king reportedly pinching his cheek as the family arrived. He attended Christmas Day services at Sandringham in December 2025 alongside his parents and siblings, as he has most years since infancy. None of this is hidden. All of it is photographed, dated, and archived by wire services. What actually happened is that Louis's appearances have simply always been sparse by design, and this year, for reasons that likely have more to do with algorithmic amplification and speculative content online than with anything happening inside Kensington Palace, that sparseness got reinterpreted as absence, and absence got reinterpreted as concealment. Where the emotional weight of this story genuinely lives is not in any hidden crisis around Louis. It lives in what the family actually did go through in 2024, a year that reshaped how Catherine, in particular, thinks about the relationship between privacy and honesty. In January 2024, Kensington Palace announced that Catherine had undergone planned abdominal surgery and would step back from public duties for a period of recovery. What followed was months of largely unfiltered public speculation. The exact dynamic royal communications teams exist to prevent, playing out at a scale nobody inside the palace had anticipated. Tabloids and social media accounts filled the gap left by an unexplained absence, with theories ranging from the mundane to the genuinely damaging, some of it cruel, most of it wrong. In March 2024, Catherine addressed the speculation directly in a personal video statement, revealing that she had been diagnosed with cancer following her surgery and had begun a course of preventative chemotherapy. The BBC and every major outlet covering the monarchy reported on both the substance of that announcement and the manner of it. Not a palace press release read by an anchor, not a written statement issued through official channels, but Catherine herself on camera, speaking directly and personally about what her family had been living through. She completed her treatment later that year and gradually returned to public life, describing the experience in her own subsequent public remarks as one that had changed her outlook, a period, in her words at the time, of getting to a place of being cancer-free, and one that had reoriented what she and William valued about time spent with their children out of the public eye. That 2024 episode is the real hinge in this family's relationship with disclosure, and it is worth sitting with, because it explains far more about their current instincts than any theory about Louis being kept away from cameras. Catherine learned firsthand under genuinely difficult circumstances, that an unexplained gap does not protect a family from scrutiny. It invites a worse version of it. The months of speculation that preceded her March statement caused real, documented harm, prompting public criticism of how aggressively some outlets and online communities had pursued theories about her whereabouts and health. William, for his part, has spoken since about how protective he felt during that period, and how the experience reinforced, rather than weakened, his instinct to guard his children's privacy specifically, even as he and Catherine became somewhat more forthcoming about their own. That distinction matters. The family did not abandon its privacy policy for the children in the wake of 2024. If anything, the opposite happened. George, Charlotte, and Louis remained shielded from any detailed public accounting of their inner lives, while their parents, particularly Catherine, became more willing to speak plainly, in their own words, about what they as adults had endured. Which brings the story to Glasgow, and to what actually happened this August, because it is the clearest evidence available of how this family now chooses to balance those two instincts. The 2026 Commonwealth Games represented the first time all three Wales children had made a public appearance together in Scotland, a country where William and Catherine hold the titles Duke and Duchess of Rothesay. Coverage from outlets, including the Daily Beast, described the choreography with a kind of grudging admiration. William and Catherine's attendance was announced in advance, as royal engagements always are, but the presence of all three children was kept quiet until the family actually arrived at the venue. There was no press release trumpeting a family outing. There was no formal statement explaining why the children were there or what it meant. They simply appeared in the stands at the Hydro to watch a netball semi-final between Australia and Jamaica, and later at the Sir Chris Hoy Velodrome for the track cycling, sitting among thousands of other spectators rather than being paraded past them. It was there that Louis, at 8 years old, became something close to a viral sensation in his own right. Not because a scandal had ended, but because a family let a child simply be a child in public, and the public responded to that with overwhelming warmth. He wore a Welsh cycling bucket hat that royal watchers noted was slightly too large for him. He was photographed yawning theatrically during a lull in the competition. He fist-bumped Finny, the game's unicorn mascot, in a photograph that circulated globally within hours. Palace-adjacent sources cited by outlets